Today, we're going to drive the Bugatti Chiron for the first time since the accident. We come so close in the last video.
Every single one of them held their breath for the same moment. The moment of Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport that Bugatti declared impossible to fix outside their network rolled out of Miami workshop with no windshield, warning lights everywhere, handmade radiators, Audi A3 airbags, a custom exhaust, and Matt Armstrong behind the wheel, describing the feeling of blood leaving his feet as he accelerated. That moment, that specific, unrepeatable, completely extraordinary moment is what 7.7 million people came to see. And what happened before it? The radiator that would not stop leaking. The 10.3 gallons of coolant that a W16 engine needs to survive. The warning lights and the fault codes and the broken crash sensor wiring and the pyro fuse that needed a new part. All of that is the reason the moment meant what it meant. And today we are taking you through every second of it. Think about the number first. 7.7 million views in 4 days on a 55-minute video. Not a short, not a highlight reel, not a 3-minute clip of a car driving down a road. A 55-minute documentary of a radiator being fixed and a cooling system being bled and warning lights being diagnosed and a car being coaxed toward the moment of first movement by a team of people who have been working toward that moment for months. 7.7 million people sat with that for 55 minutes. Because the story behind the radiator and the warning lights and the first drive is not a technical story. It is a human story. It is a story of what happens when one man refuses to accept that the most powerful car manufacturer in the world has the final word on whether a car lives or dies. And 7.7 million people needed to see how that story ended. But before we get to the first drive, before we get to the moment Matt Armstrong felt the blood leave his feet, and the Chiron rolled out of the workshop still missing its windshield and still covered in warning lights and still looking like the most expensive science project in Miami, we need to go back to where the specific chapter started. Because the first drive did not begin on the day Matt Armstrong sat in the driver's seat. It began 3 days earlier in the fabrication workshop, where a man named Bob was building radiators from scratch. And those radiators, those handmade replacements for the 10 radiators that a Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport requires to keep its W16 engine alive, are the unsung heroes of one of the most watched automotive moments in YouTube history. Bob, from the machine shop, the man that Matt Armstrong's audience tried to blame for problems earlier in the build, and who Matt Armstrong publicly defended, the man who has a YouTube channel of his own, and who brought to this project a fabrication skill set that solved problems that conventional sourcing simply could not address. Bob built the replacement radiators from scratch, using the original tanks from the destroyed units and new cores fabricated to the specification that the Chiron required. 10 radiators. Not 10 identical radiators. 10 radiators in different configurations for different positions in the car's extraordinarily complex cooling architecture. And then, on top of that, 60 hours. 60 hours of Bob's time creating a custom front crash bar from scratch, without a 3D scan of the original to use as a reference, without an OEM part to copy, working from understanding and measurement and fabrication skill to replicate a component so precisely that it bolted directly to the chassis legs with the original mounting points and threads intact. Bob did that, without the 3D scan, in 60 hours. And the people who were blaming Bob for the radiator leak need to understand what Bob actually built before they finish that sentence. Because here is what happened with the radiator that nearly stopped the first drive before it started. The front radiator failed a pressure test. Not dramatically. Not with a catastrophic burst that soaked the workshop and destroyed everything around it. It failed quietly. A leak, small enough to be found only through systematic pressure testing. Large enough to be completely unacceptable in a car that needs its cooling system to function perfectly before the W16 engine that produces nearly 1,500 horsepower can be trusted to run at operating temperature. And the suspected cause was damage in transit. The radiator that Bob had fabricated had been damaged on its way to the car, not through any failure of Bob's work, through the specific misfortune of transit damage to a component that had no margin for imperfection once installed. And fixing it, finding the leak, addressing it precisely enough that the pressure test would pass, was the first battle of the first drive day. Now let's talk about 10.3 gallons. Because that number, the specific volume of coolant that the Bugatti Chiron's cooling system holds, is one of the most quietly extraordinary details in the entire first drive story. 10.3 gallons. That is not a number that most people have a reference point for in the context of a car's cooling system. A family car might hold 1.5 gallons. A large SUV might hold 2 or 3. 10.3 gallons is what a W16 engine with 4 turbochargers and the thermal management requirements of nearly 1,500 horsepower demands from its cooling architecture. And filling that system, bleeding it properly, ensuring that every air pocket has been purged and every section of the circuit has coolant where coolant needs to be, is a process that takes time and patience and a specific knowledge of how this particular system wants to be filled. Get it wrong and the consequences range from overheating to catastrophic engine failure. Get it right, and you have cleared the most critical single prerequisite for running the car to operating temperature. And running the car to operating temperature was the prerequisite for the first drive. The moment the coolant temperature started climbing was the moment the entire workshop held its collective breath. Because this was the first time that the W16 engine, rebuilt around repaired components and handmade parts and creative sourcing from channels that Bugatti's official network had nothing to do with, was going to be asked to sustain itself under thermal load. The temperature climbing toward 194 degrees Fahrenheit. The team watching every gauge. Watching for the moment the fans kicked in. Watching confirm that the thermal management system that had been rebuilt around custom radiators and improvised components was actually going to do the job it needed to do. And then the temperature settled, around the high 190s and low 200s as the fans engaged, for a car that had been split apart, for a car rebuilt around handmade cooling hardware, for a car that had no business being anywhere near operating temperature, according to the official position of the manufacturer that built it. It settled, and the workshop breathed, but then came the warning lights. And this is where the first drive story gets genuinely dramatic in a way that the casual viewer, watching the eventual drive footage and experiencing the relief and the triumph of it, might not fully appreciate. Because when the car first moved, when the Chiron was powered up and the systems came online, the dashboard was not a clean display of a healthy car ready for its first test. It was a Christmas tree. Warning lights everywhere. Traction control. EPC. Airbag system. Steering. Stabilization control. Every system that had been rebuilt or replaced or addressed during the course of the build, reporting its presence in a language that rebuilt systems use when they come back online in a car that's been through what this one has been through, a forest of amber and red. And the task of sorting that forest, of understanding which lights represented real faults requiring real attention, and which lights would clear once the car moved and the systems had a chance to calibrate to their new reality, was a final challenge standing between the workshop and the first drive. Some cleared. The moment the car moved, some of the warning lights extinguished. The systems that had been reporting their uncertainty about their operating state found their calibration in motion and decided they were fine. Traction control and stabilization systems that need the car to be moving to confirm their own function confirmed it and went quiet. And in their place came the real faults. The ones that motion had exposed rather than cleared. 2 specific issues emerged from the warning light forest that the team had to address before the first drive could happen with any confidence. The crash sensor wiring. Broken. A fault that needed a soldering iron and the patience to find the specific break in a wiring loom that the crash and the rebuild and the months of disassembly and reassembly had compromised. Found. Soldered. Cleared. And the pyro fuse. A battery interruption igniter, a safety component that had been triggered by the crash and that could not be reset, a component that needed to be replaced rather than repaired, a new part required. In the middle of the first drive day, with the car running, with the coolant temperature settled, with the workshop team standing around a Bugatti Chiron that was as close to its first movement, needing a single part that a new round of sourcing was going to have to find. And here is where the real test of this team's preparation and their network and their commitment to getting the job done on this specific day became visible. Because sourcing a pyro fuse for a Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport is not a parts store visit. It is not a next-day delivery from an online retailer. It is a kind of specific, rare, manufacturer proprietary component that in any other context would be a multi-week wait through official channels. In Matt Armstrong's context, it was a problem that the team solved that day, through the network that months of creative sourcing had built, through the contacts and the channels and the relationships that every previous obstacle in this build had forced into existence. The part arrived. The pyro fuse was replaced. The warning light for the battery interruption igniter cleared, and the forest of warnings thinned to the point where the first drive was not just possible but necessary, because the car was telling them it was ready, and Matt Armstrong was not going to make it wait any longer than it already had. The preparation for the actual first drive movement was practical and deliberate and entirely consistent with who Matt Armstrong is and how he approaches every critical moment in his builds. No windshield. The car still missing its windshield when it rolled out for the first time, still looking, to anyone seeing it from the outside, like an unfinished project, like a work in progress, like something that was not quite ready for the road. And that appearance was honest. The car was not road legal. Not yet. The first drive was not a public road test. It was a workshop yard shakedown, a confirmation that the things that had been built and rebuilt and sourced and fabricated and welded and machined and improvised over months of work actually did what they were built to do when the car was moving. Not a celebration, a test. And the distinction between those two things is one of the most important distinctions in the entire story. The car rolled out. The W16 engine that Bob's radiators were keeping cool at operating temperature sent its 1,500 horsepower through the transmission that had been split and repaired and rejoined with 14 titanium bolts and produced movement. Real movement. The Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport that Bugatti had declared impossible to rebuild independently, that they had blacklisted and refused parts for, and had their CEO publicly opposed on safety grounds, rolled forward under its own power in the yard of Miami workshop. And Matt Armstrong described what it felt like. He described it in the most direct and most honest and most perfectly Matt Armstrong way possible. He said it was so fast that he could feel the blood coming out his feet